A single father, a deserted road, a young woman left to die in a storm. What Dorian Flintwood discovered that rainy October evening wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a calculated plan to commit the perfect crime. A plan that would have worked if he hadn't taken one wrong turn. This is the story of how one decision to stop changed 3 lives forever. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. Dorian Flintwood squinted through his windshield, his wipers working overtime against the downpour as he navigated the sharp curves of Old Mill Road. This wasn't supposed to be his route. Construction on Highway 41 had forced him here, onto this forgotten stretch of asphalt that cut through abandoned farmland and towns time had left behind. He was already running late, already calculating how to explain to 12-year-old Marilla why he'd missed picking her up from piano practice again, when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the rain, a shape on the side of the road that didn't belong. But as his headlights cut through the storm, his breath caught in his throat. A wheelchair. Someone was sitting in it. What the? Dorian's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed down, his mind racing. Out here? In this weather? The figure didn't move, just sat there, hunched over, as rain pounded down relentlessly. Dorian pulled over without thinking, his emergency flashers cutting red patterns through the gray afternoon, his shoes splashing through puddles that had formed in the gravel. As he got closer, he could hear it, sobbing, deep, broken sounds that cut through even the roar of the storm. Miss, can you hear me?" When she lifted her head, Dorian felt his heart crack. She couldn't have been more than 23, 24 years old. Blonde hair plastered to her face, hazel eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, like she couldn't quite believe someone had actually stopped. "Please." Her voice was barely a whisper, shaking from cold and something deeper. "Please don't leave me here." "I'm not going anywhere," Dorian said, and he meant it. "What's your name? What happened to you?" "Audrey." She was shivering so violently she could barely get the words out. "Audrey Smith. They left me." Dorian felt anger flash through him, hot and immediate. "Who left you?" But Audrey just shook her head, fresh tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. Dorian didn't waste time with more questions. He scooped Audrey out of the wheelchair, she weighed almost nothing, like a bird, and carried her to his SUV. She didn't protest, just clung to his jacket with trembling fingers as he settled her in the back seat. He went back for the wheelchair, collapsing it with fumbling hands before shoving it in his trunk. Inside the car, with the heat blasting and the rain finally shut out, Audrey wrapped both hands around the coffee thermos Dorian offered her. He watched as she brought it to her lips, her whole body still shaking, even with the blanket he had given her. "We need to get you to a hospital," Dorian said, already reaching for his phone. "No!" The force of her response made him freeze. "Please, no hospital. They'll find me there. They'll finish what they started." Dorian turned in his seat to look at her fully. "Who will find you, Audrey?" Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something that made his blood run cold. Pure, unadulterated fear. "My stepmother, my stepbrother. They did this. They left me here to die." The words hung in the air between them, so outrageous that for a moment Dorian wondered if he'd heard her correctly, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. She was telling the truth. He made a decision that would later seem either incredibly foolish or divinely inspired. "Okay, no hospital, but you need to get warm, and you need to tell me everything." Dorian pulled back onto Old Mill Road, his mind already rearranging his afternoon. Morella's piano teacher lived 2 blocks from their house. He'd call, explain he was running late,
ask her to drop Morella off. His neighbor, Mrs. Pataki, would be home. She was a retired nurse, someone he trusted. As he drove, Audrey spoke in fits and starts, her voice gaining strength as warmth slowly returned to her body. "I've been out there for 4 hours," she said, staring at her hands. 4 hours in the rain. I screamed until I couldn't anymore. I really thought this was it, that I'd die out here and no one would ever know what they did. "How did you end up on this road?" Dorian asked, keeping his voice gentle even as rage simmered beneath his calm exterior. "They told me we were going on a family trip." Audrey laughed, but it was a broken sound. "To help us grieve together. We were supposed to be heading to a spa retreat in the mountains, but they kept taking turns I didn't recognize. And then we were here, on this empty road, and Bradley said he needed to check the engine." She paused, her breathing shaky. "Francine, my stepmother, she suggested I'd get some fresh air, said the view was beautiful from this spot. They helped me into my wheelchair, positioned me just right, and then they got back in the car." Dorian's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. "And they just drove away?" Audrey looked back once, right at me. I called out, thinking maybe they'd forgotten, maybe this was some kind of mistake. But he just stared at me for a second, and then they drove off. Audrey's voice cracked. I watched their taillights disappear, and I knew they were really going to let me die out here.
"How long ago did your father die?" Dorian asked quietly. Audrey's head snapped up. "How did you said grieve together. And you mentioned a stepmother. I'm guessing something changed recently that made them do this." For a moment, Audrey just stared at him. Then she nodded slowly. 3 weeks ago, my father had a massive stroke. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived." "I'm sorry," Dorian said and meant it. He knew that particular pain all too well. His own wife had died 4 years ago from complications during what should have been a routine surgery. One day she was there, laughing at breakfast, kissing Morella goodbye. The next she was gone. "Thank you," Audrey whispered. "He was everything to me, especially after my accident." "Your accident?" "Horseback riding. I was 15. One moment I was jumping a fence, the next I was on the ground, unable to feel my legs. I've been paralyzed from the waist down ever since." The pieces were starting to come together in Dorian's mind, a picture forming that made his stomach turn. "And your father took care of you?" "He never made me feel like a burden, never once. When he remarried, I thought Francine would be good for him. She seemed so kind, so understanding. Her son Bradley was 22, charming, always asking how I was doing." "But it was an act." "I didn't see it at first. The little comments only came when Dad wasn't around. Questions about how much my care cost. Suggestions that maybe I'd be happier in a facility with people who could help me properly. I told myself I was being paranoid, too sensitive." Dorian pulled into his driveway, a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet Marietta neighborhood. Through the rain, he could see Mrs. Pataki's lights on next door. "What changed 3 weeks ago?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Audrey's smile was bitter. "I found out why they stayed, why they played nice all these years. My father's will was read 2 days after the funeral. He'd updated it 6 months ago. I didn't even know. He left almost everything to me. The house, his investment portfolio, his classic car collection. Francine and Bradley each got $50,000. The rest, over $2 million, came to me, with detailed instructions for my ongoing care." The number made Dorian blink. $2 million. More than enough motive for murder. "They hid it well," Audrey continued. "Said we should take a trip, just the 3 of us, to heal as a family. I actually believed them. I thought they were trying to help me through my grief." She looked at Dorian, her eyes shining with tears. "How stupid could I be?" "You're not stupid," Dorian said firmly. "You trusted people who were supposed to be family. That's not stupid, Audrey. That's human." He got out and came around to her door, lifting her again. Mrs. Pataki was already coming down her porch steps, umbrella in hand, her round face creased with concern.
Dorian, what's happened? I need your help, Elena. This is Audrey. She's in trouble and she needs somewhere safe. Within 20 minutes, Audrey was in dry clothes, borrowed from what remained of Dorian's late wife's wardrobe, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Mrs. Pataki had checked her vital signs, declared her fortunate to have avoided hypothermia, and was now making tea in the kitchen while Dorian called Morella's piano teacher. The house felt strange with Audrey in it. It had been just him and Morella for so long, their routines and rhythms set in stone. But as he watched this young woman who'd nearly died on a deserted road, clutching a mug of chamomile tea with both hands, Dorian felt something shift inside him, a purpose he hadn't felt in years.
When Morella came home, dropped off by Mrs. Ruth with profuse apologies for the last-minute change, she stopped in the doorway of the living room, taking in the scene. "Dad?" Dorian stood, ready to explain, but Morella was already moving forward, her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked Audrey directly. Audrey looked surprised by the question, by being addressed so simply. I'm getting there. She needs our help, sweetheart. She's in trouble and she needs somewhere safe to stay for a while." Morella didn't hesitate. "She can have the guest room. It's on the first floor, so she won't have to worry about stairs, and it has its own bathroom." Pride swelled in Dorian's chest. His daughter had her mother's compassionate heart. Over the next few hours, as evening settled into night, and Mrs. Pataki finally went home with promises to return in the morning, Audrey told them everything. The whole story spilled out. Her father's death, the will reading, the fake family trip, the 4 hours in the rain. Morella sat on the floor by Audrey's feet, listening with wide eyes. Dorian paced, his investigator's mind already working through the problem, because it was a problem, a massive one. "We need to go to the police. Tonight." "They've already beaten us there," Audrey said quietly. "I guarantee it. They'll have reported me missing by now. They'll say I disappeared at a rest stop, that they've been searching frantically. They're smart, Dorian. They've been planning this."
She was right, and Dorian knew it. But he also knew something else. "I spent 15 years as an insurance investigator," he said, "before I went freelance. I know how to find the truth when people are lying. And more importantly, I know liars always make mistakes. Always." Audrey looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. He saw hope. "You really think we can prove what they did?" "I know we can," Dorian said, "but we have to be smart about this, strategic." The next morning they went to the police. Just as Audrey had predicted, Francine and Bradley had already filed a missing person report. The officer who took Audrey's statement was sympathetic, but clearly skeptical. "Ma'am, your stepmother and stepbrother have been on the local news. They've been organizing search parties. Are you saying all of that was fabricated?" "Yes," Audrey said steadily. "Every word of it." "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." The officer sighed. "Without evidence, this becomes a he-said-she-said situation. Do you have any proof they abandoned you?" Audrey's face fell. "The rain. It would have washed away any tire tracks." "No cameras on Old Mill Road either," the officer said, not unkindly. "Look, I'll file the report. We'll investigate. But I want you to understand, proving attempted murder is incredibly difficult in cases like this." Outside the station, Audrey slumped in her wheelchair. "They're going to get away with it." "No," Dorian said firmly, "they're not." He called Jerome Washington that afternoon. They'd gone to college together, stayed friends even after Jerome went to law school and Dorian went into insurance investigation. Jerome now ran a small practice specializing in civil rights and elder abuse cases. "Elder abuse?" Jerome asked when Dorian explained the situation over the phone. "She's disabled and was dependent on her father's care. Under Georgia law, that extends protection even though she's 23. You've been doing your homework. I told you I know how to investigate." Jerome came over that evening, listened to Audrey's story, and agreed to take the case pro bono. But his assessment was grim. "Without hard evidence, we're fighting uphill," he said, sitting at Dorian's dining room table with papers spread out in front of him. We can file civil charges, try to freeze the estate assets, but proving attempted murder, that's another level entirely. So we find the evidence, Dorian said. Where? The rain washed away any physical evidence from the scene. There were no witnesses. It's literally her word against theirs. Dorian leaned back in his chair, his mind working. Liars make mistakes, Jerome. Always. We just have to find theirs. Over the next 3 weeks, Dorian worked. While Audrey settled into the guest room and Morella helped her navigate their home, he dug into Francine and Bradley's lives like he was investigating an insurance fraud case, which, in a way, he was. He reviewed credit card statements that Audrey provided access to from her father's estate accounts. He tracked Bradley's social media, noting locations and timestamps. He interviewed neighbors from Audrey's father's neighborhood, asking careful questions about Francine and Bradley's behavior. And slowly, a picture emerged. A picture of two people who'd been waiting, who'd played their parts perfectly while William Winters was alive, but whose mask had slipped the moment he died. A neighbor, Mrs. Sarah, remembered Francine complaining loudly about how much that girl costs just days after the funeral. The comment had struck her as odd at the time, cruel even, but she hadn't known what to do with the information. A nurse from the hospital where William had his stroke remembered Bradley asking about the cheapest care facilities in the state while his stepfather was literally dying in the next room. But it was the credit card statement that gave Dorian his breakthrough. He was sitting at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets when he saw it. A charge on Bradley's credit card from a gas station on Old Mill Road. The timestamp made his heart race. 3:47 p.m. on the day Audrey was abandoned. According to the missing person report, Bradley and Francine claims to have been searching for Audrey at a rest stop on Highway 41, 50 miles away, at that exact time. Dorian immediately pulled up the gas station's information. It was called Miller's Stop, a tiny place that had somehow survived despite being in the middle of nowhere. He called the next morning, claiming to be from an insurance company investigating a claim. "Do you have security cameras?" he asked the owner, a man named Rick Miller. "Sure do. Had them installed after we got robbed 3 years back." "How long do you keep the footage?" "System backs up to the cloud. I keep it for 90 days in case of disputes." Dorian's pulse quickened. "I need footage from October 12th, around 3:45 p.m. "You'll need a subpoena for that." "You'll have one." Jerome filed the motion the next day. The subpoena was granted within a week. And when Dorian finally saw the footage, sitting in Jerome's office with Audrey beside him, he felt vindication surge through him like electricity.
There, in grainy but clear footage, was Bradley's black Mercedes pulling up to pump 3. The timestamp read 3:47 p.m. Bradley got out, filled the tank, and then at 3:52 p.m., Francine stepped out of the passenger side to go inside, presumably to pay. Both of their faces were clearly visible. "They were there," Audrey whispered. 2 miles from where they left me, right when they said they were 50 miles away searching." "Not just there," Dorian said, pointing to the screen. "Look at the direction they're coming from." The camera angle showed the road. Bradley's car had come from the south, from the direction of Old Mill Road. It was heading north, away from where Audrey had been left. They weren't searching for her. They were leaving her behind. Jerome leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This is it. This is what we needed." "Can we get them arrested?" Audrey asked, her voice shaking. "We can do better than that," Jerome said. "We can bury them." The arrests happened on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Dorian had found Audrey in the rain. Francine was taken into custody at a yoga class. Bradley was arrested at his apartment, still in pajamas. The local news, which had been covering their desperate search for Audrey, suddenly had a very different story to tell. The charges were staggering: attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and a half-dozen other counts that Jerome had carefully compiled. Their lawyers were expensive, sleek, and confident. At the arraignment, they painted Audrey as mentally unstable, suggested she'd orchestrated her own disappearance for attention, implied that she was trying to keep the inheritance all for herself. But Dorian had been busy in the weeks leading up to trial.
He'd gathered every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every contradiction in Francine and Bradley's story. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The courtroom was packed. Audrey sat at the plaintiff's table with Jerome, her wheelchair positioned carefully beside him. Dorian sat in the front row, Mirella beside him when school allowed. Mrs. Pataki came every day, her Slovak accent growing thicker with indignation as the evidence mounted. Francine's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a loving stepmother distraught over her missing stepdaughter. But Jerome was ready.
"Mrs. Winters," he said during cross-examination, his voice calm and measured, "can you explain why your son's credit card shows a charge at Miller's Stop on Old Mill Road at 3:47 p.m. on October 12th, when you claim to have been searching for Audrey at a rest stop 50 miles away?" Francine's face went pale. We must have stopped there earlier. The missing person report you filed says Audrey disappeared at 2:30 p.m. The gas station footage shows you arriving at 3:47, coming from the direction of Old Mill Road, where Audrey was found. Can you explain that? We were confused about the timeline. Confused enough to be in 2 places at once? The courtroom murmured. Bradley's testimony was worse. He was cocky at first, assured in his lies, but when Jerome played the security footage, showing Bradley pumping gas, showing Francine walking into the store, showing them driving away from where Audrey had been abandoned, his confidence crumbled. "That doesn't prove anything. It proves you lied about your location. It proves you were exactly where Audrey said you were. And it proves you were driving away from the scene, not toward it." Mrs. Sarah testified about Francine's cruel comments. The hospital nurse testified about Bradley's callous questions. Other neighbors came forward with stories of coldness, of barely concealed resentment whenever William's care for Audrey was mentioned. And then Audrey took the stand.
She was calm, clear, devastating in her testimony. She described the family trip, the growing unease as they took unfamiliar roads, the moment of realization when she understood what was happening. "Bradley looked at me," she said, her voice steady, even as tears ran down her face. "Right in the eyes. I called out to him, begged him not to leave me, and he just stared at me, turned around, and drove away." "How long were you alone before Mr. Flintwood found you?" Jerome asked gently. 4 hours. "And in those 4 hours, in the rain, what did you think about?" "I thought about my father, about how much I missed him. I thought about how I was going to die in the same storm that had washed away any evidence of what they'd done. I thought about how perfect their plan was." She paused, wiping her eyes. "And then headlights appeared. And I thought I was hallucinating, that my mind was giving me false hope in my last moments. But the car stopped. And Dorian Flintwood saved my life." The jury was silent. Several members were crying. Francine and Bradley's lawyers tried to recover, tried to poke holes in the timeline, tried to suggest alternative explanations, but the evidence was overwhelming. The lies were too many, too obvious. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty, on all counts. The sentencing came a week later, 15 years each to be served in separate facilities, restitution to Audrey for emotional damages, restraining orders that would extend past their release. As the bailiff led them away, Bradley looked back one more time, not at Audrey, but at Dorian. The hatred in his eyes was palpable. Dorian stared back unflinching. He'd seen evil before. This was just another version of it. Outside the courthouse, Audrey broke down in her wheelchair, great heaving sobs of relief and grief and 100 other emotions she'd been holding back. Dorian knelt beside her, not caring who saw, and let her cry on his shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's really over." Jerome was standing nearby with Mirella and Mrs. Pataki giving them space. When Audrey finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, she looked at Dorian with such gratitude it almost hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have just dropped me at a police station that first day and washed your hands of me." "No," Dorian said firmly. "I couldn't have. That's not who I am." And it was true. From the moment he'd seen her in that wheelchair in the rain, there had been no other choice. Not for him.
The weeks following the trial were strange. The media attention faded.
The journalists stopped calling. Life began to settle into something resembling normal, except nothing was normal anymore. Audrey used part of her inheritance to make Dorian's home fully accessible. Ramps, wider doorways, a modified bathroom. She insisted on contributing to household expenses despite Dorian's protests. "You gave me my life back," she said when he argued. "This is the least I can do." But it wasn't about the money or the modifications. It was about belonging. Morella and Audrey had bonded during those weeks of investigation and trial preparation. Audrey helped with homework, taught Morella to paint watercolors from her wheelchair, listened to her practice piano for hours without complaint. "She's like a mom," said Morella one night to Dorian, "but not replacing mom. Does that make sense?" It did. Dorian's late wife Sarah would have loved Audrey. She'd had the same quiet strength, the same refusal to let circumstances define her. And somewhere in the daily rhythms of breakfast and homework and painting lessons and shared dinners, something shifted between Dorian and Audrey. It started small. The way Audrey laughed at his terrible jokes. The way Dorian found himself making coffee exactly how she liked it without asking. The way their conversations stretched long into the night after Morella went to bed, talking about everything and nothing. Mrs. Pataki noticed, of course. She'd bring over her Slovak pastries and give Dorian knowing looks that made him feel like a teenager. "That girl, she's good for you," Mrs. Pataki said one afternoon, her accent thick with certainty. "You smile again. I haven't seen you smile like that since Sarah." Dorian wanted to protest, to say it wasn't like that, but he couldn't, because it was becoming exactly like that.
3 months after the trial, on a cold January evening, Audrey was in the kitchen making hot chocolate when Dorian came home from a consulting job. She'd been living with them for 6 months now, and the house felt empty when she wasn't in it. "How was the audit?" she asked, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. "Boring as usual. Found the discrepancy, though." "You always do." There was affection in her voice, casual and comfortable, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. Dorian sat at the kitchen table, watching her navigate the kitchen in her wheelchair with practiced ease. "Audrey, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you happy here?" Now she did look up, surprise crossing her face. "Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" "Because you have options now. The inheritance, the house from your father. You could go anywhere, do anything." Understanding dawned in her hazel eyes. "Are you trying to get rid of me, Dorian Flintwood?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended. "No, that's not. I just want to make sure you're staying because you want to, not because you feel obligated." Audrey set down the spoon and wheeled over to him. "I'm staying because this is the first place I felt like I belong since my father died. I'm staying because Morella makes me laugh, and Mrs. Pataki feeds me too much, and you—" She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "You make me feel safe, seen, like I'm not just the girl in the wheelchair, but actually me." Dorian's heart was hammering in his chest. "Audrey," "She knows. I know it's complicated. You saved my life. There's probably a million reasons why this is a bad idea, but I can't help how I feel, and I feel—" He kissed her. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought out. He just leaned down and kissed her, cutting off her rambling with the simplest truth he knew. When they pulled apart, Audrey was staring at him with wide eyes. "I've wanted to do that for 2 months, Dorian admitted. "But I didn't know if you... after everything you've been through..." "Dorian?" "Yeah?" "Shut up and kiss me again." So he did. When Morella came home from her friend's house an hour later, she found them in the living room, Audrey in her wheelchair and Dorian sitting on the couch beside her, their hands intertwined. "Finally," Morella said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "I've been waiting for you two to figure it out." Dorian blinked. "You knew?" "Dad, everyone knew. Even Mrs. Pataki's been making comments." Audrey laughed, the sound bright and free. "Your daughter is very observant." "She gets it from her mother," Dorian said.
And for the first time in 4 years, saying that didn't hurt. It was just true. Morella came over and hugged them both. Does this mean Audrey's staying forever? Dorian looked at Audrey, a question in his eyes. She squeezed his hand. If you'll have me, she said softly. Forever sounds perfect. The months that followed were the happiest Dorian could remember since Sarah's death. It wasn't the same. It couldn't be. Shouldn't be. This was different. New. Built on survival and trust, and the strange alchemy that happens when two broken people find ways to fit their pieces together. They took things slow. Dorian was in no rush, and Audrey had learned the hard way that people could hide who they really were. But every day brought new confirmations that this was real. This was right.
Audrey started a nonprofit helping other disabled individuals who'd been taken advantage of by family members. She called it Second Chances. And Dorian helped with the legal framework, using his investigative skills to track down and expose fraudulent guardianships. Morella thrived with Audrey in her life. Her grades improved, her confidence grew. She'd found a role model who showed her that strength came in many forms. And Dorian? Dorian found that rescuing Audrey had rescued him too, from the half-life he'd been living, going through the motions, raising his daughter, but forgetting to actually live. 9 months after he'd found her in the rain, on a warm July evening, Dorian found Audrey in the garden they'd planted together. She was teaching Morella how to stake tomato plants, their laughter carrying on the breeze. He stood at the back door, just watching. The sunset painted everything gold, and in that moment, Dorian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Complete peace. Audrey must have sensed him watching, because she turned, catching his eye. The smile she gave him was radiant, full of joy and love and gratitude and 1,000 other things that didn't need words. He walked over, kissed the top of her head, ruffled Morella's hair. "What are you thinking about?" Audrey asked, tilting her face up to look at him. How one wrong turn changed everything. How if construction hadn't closed Highway 41, if I hadn't taken Old Mill Road, if I'd driven past without stopping. But you didn't, Audrey interrupted gently. You stopped. You saved me. And maybe I saved you a little too. More than a little. Morella made a gagging sound. You two are so mushy. You love it, Audrey teased. Yeah, I really do. That night, after Morella had gone to bed, Dorian and Audrey sat on the back porch watching fireflies blink in the darkness. Audrey's wheelchair was pulled close to the bench where Dorian sat, their hands clasped together. Do you ever think about that day? Audrey asked quietly, about how close it came? Every day, Dorian said, and I'm grateful every time that I was there, that I found you. What do you think would have happened if you hadn't? Dorian squeezed her hand. I don't let myself think about that. Audrey said, sometimes I wake up and for a second I'm back there, in the rain, alone, and then I remember I'm here. I'm safe. I'm loved, and it feels like a miracle. You are loved, Dorian said firmly, by Morella, by Mrs. Pataki, by me. Audrey turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the porch light. I love you too. I know we haven't said it yet, but I do. I love you, Dorian Flintwood. I love you, Audrey Smith. From that first moment I saw you in the rain, something in me recognized something in you. Like we were always supposed to find each other. We just needed the universe to give us a push. Some push, Audrey said with a small laugh. Attempted murder and a rainstorm. Not how I would have planned it, Dorian agreed, but I'll take it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of suburban Georgia. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A car drove past. Life, ordinary and extraordinary, all at once. Audrey, Dorian said suddenly, his heart pounding. He'd been carrying the ring in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. There's something I want to ask you. She turned to him, curiosity in her eyes. What is it? He slid off the bench and knelt beside her wheelchair, pulling out the small velvet box.
Audrey's hands flew to her mouth. I know it's only been 9 months, Dorian said. I know some people would say it's too fast, but I also know that life is fragile and precious and can change in an instant. I know that when you find something real, something worth holding on to, you don't let it go. Audrey Smith, will you marry me? Tears streamed down Audrey's face as she nodded. Yes, yes, absolutely yes.
Dorian slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple band with a small diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. When he stood to kiss her, she pulled him close, and they stayed like that for a long moment, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way. From inside the house, they heard a squeal. Morella appeared at the window, pressing her face against the glass with the biggest grin Dorian had ever seen. She was spying, Audrey laughed through her tears. Of course she was, Dorian said. I asked her permission first. She's been insufferable about keeping the secret. Morella burst through the back door. Can I be the maid of honor? Please say I can be the maid of honor. Of course you can, Audrey said, opening her arms. Morella hugged them both, and standing there on the porch with his daughter and his future wife, Dorian felt his heart overflow. 3 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Dorian had found Audrey on Old Mill Road, they were married in the backyard of their Marietta home. The ceremony was small, intimate, perfect. White chairs arranged in rows on the grass, an archway covered in autumn flowers, and less than 50 guests who mattered most. Mrs. Pataki sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jerome stood beside Dorian as best man, grinning like he'd personally orchestrated the whole thing. And Morella, in a deep burgundy dress that matched the fall leaves, stood beside Audrey as maid of honor, holding her bouquet with trembling hands. Audrey wore ivory, a simple dress that she'd chosen specifically because she could wear it while seated in her wheelchair. Her blonde hair was pinned up with small white flowers woven through it, and when Dorian saw her coming down the makeshift aisle, Mrs. Pataki pushing her chair, his breath caught. She was radiant.
The officiant, a kind woman named Pastor Michaels who'd counseled them through their engagement, smiled warmly at the gathered crowd. We're here today to celebrate something beautiful. Not just a wedding, but a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the unexpected ways love finds us. Dorian and Audrey had written their own vows. When it was his turn, Dorian took Audrey's hands in his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Audrey, a year ago I found you on the worst day of your life, but you've given me the best days of mine. You've shown me that healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about building something new with someone brave enough to try again. You've loved my daughter like she's your own. You filled our home with laughter and hope. And you've reminded me that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply letting yourself be loved. I promise to protect you, to cherish you, to be worthy of the gift you've given me every single day. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Audrey's voice shook as she began her vows, but it was filled with conviction. Dorian, you stopped when everyone else would have driven past. You saw me, really saw me, not as a burden or a charity case, but as a person worth saving. You fought for me when I'd given up fighting for myself. You've given me a home, a family, a future I never thought I'd have. I promise to love you fiercely, to support your dreams, to be the partner you deserve. And I promise to never forget that love isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up, day after day, even in the rain. When Pastor Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, and Dorian leaned down to kiss his bride, the small crowd erupted in applause. Morella cheered the loudest, throwing flower petals in the air with abandon. The reception was held right there in the backyard, under string lights that twinkled like stars. Mrs. Pataki had made enough Slovak pastries to feed an army. Jerome gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying simultaneously, recounting how Dorian had called him in a panic about a legal nightmare that had turned into the greatest love story he'd ever witnessed. But the moment that would stay with everyone was when Morella stood up, tapping her glass for attention. At 13 now, she'd grown taller, more confident, her dark hair pinned back like Audrey's. I just want to say something, she began, her voice clear. A year ago, my dad brought home a stranger who needed help, and I gained a second mom who chose to be here, chose to love us, chose our family. Audrey, You've taught me that strength isn't about what your body can do, it's about what your heart is brave enough to feel. Thank you for loving my dad. Thank you for loving me. And thank you for showing me what it means to never give up, even when the world gives you every reason to do so." Audrey was openly crying now, reaching for Morella's hand. "Come here, sweetheart." Morella knelt beside the wheelchair, and Audrey hugged her tight, whispering something that made Morella nod and smile through her own tears. As the sun set and the party continued, Dorian and Audrey found a quiet moment together near the flower archway. He stood behind her wheelchair, his hands on her shoulders, both of them looking out at their guests, their family. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Beyond words," Audrey replied, tilting her head back to look up at him. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now, I can't imagine it being anything other than this." "Neither can I," Dorian said, bending to kiss her forehead. They stayed like that as the evening deepened into night, as laughter and music filled the air, as their small corner of the world celebrated not just a wedding, but a triumph, a victory over cruelty, over despair, over everything that had tried to destroy them.
And in that moment, surrounded by love and light and possibility, they knew they'd found something rare, something worth every hardship, every tear, every moment of doubt. They'd found home. Old Mill Road still exists, winding through abandoned farmland and forgotten towns. Rain still falls there, washing away old tracks and old sins. But in a modest house in Marietta, Georgia, there's only sunshine and laughter and the quiet strength of people who learned the hard way that love isn't about what you're born into, it's about what you choose to build. Dorian had stopped on that road looking to help someone in need. He'd found someone to save, but in saving her, he'd found something else entirely, a reason to believe in second chances. For Audrey, for Morella, for himself. Sometimes the greatest rescues don't just save a life, they create a future worth living. And in that future, in that home filled with love and hope and possibility, 3 people who'd lost so much had found everything that mattered. They'd found each other, and that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, reminded you that kindness can change everything, and showed you that found families are just as real as born families, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that prove love, courage, and compassion can triumph even in the darkest storms. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to drive past someone in need.